Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Tom Clancy's The Division for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a third-person shooter developed by Ubisoft Massive and released in March of this year, and it's kind of interesting in terms of the raw concept, but it's more interesting in the fact that it's apparently Ubisoft's best-selling game so far, and yet at the same time the critical reception was pretty lukewarm at best, and most players pretty much abandoned it in the immediate aftermath. A lot of that is probably due to the very misleading marketing campaign that this thing had, where it was showing vertical slices that were far better looking than what we actually got in the full game, even though the full game is actually still a very good looking game. And they acted like not only was it going to be bigger than it actually is, but they also acted like the co-op as well as the rogue mechanics were going to be much more prevalent and more interesting than they actually turned out to be. Let's go ahead and set aside the marketing materials for the time being and talk about what really matters here, the game itself. Did it actually turn out okay, or did something else happen entirely? Well, as far as presentation goes, Ubisoft Massive did a fantastic job of the environmental art in particular. You look at any one of these moments throughout the course of the game, and the environments themselves are downright gorgeous. You've got massive amounts of detail on everything throughout the environments. You've got some really nice snow effects going on, and it really does do a great job of making you feel immersed in that city. There's also a bunch of really nice smaller touches as well, like the fact that when it's snowing heavily, snow will actually start to accumulate on your character as opposed to just simply falling in a sort of particle effect fashion, or the fact that your character never puts their finger on the trigger of their guns unless they're actually aiming it at something. Which is of course something that your average person who knows absolutely nothing about firearms and thus knows absolutely nothing about firearms safety will just think is completely irrelevant or won't even think about it at all, but for people who actually will notice things like that, it's a pretty nice touch. That said, this all does come at a bit of a price because this thing doesn't exactly run all that well. On my i7-4790K 16 gigs of RAM and GTX 970, I'm usually getting somewhere between 45 and 55 frames a second on pretty much max settings. It's not completely maxed out, but it's mostly maxed out. So it's definitely playable, but it's not really the smoothest experience, and I did notice numerous drops down below 30 frames a second that didn't really make a whole lot of sense. And I haven't really noticed all that many performance improvements on people who have higher end rigs than mine. It's basically just a matter of maybe 5 to 10 more frames a second, so I'm not really sure what exactly is causing the frame rate to tank so much, but it does mean that if you're wanting to get that 60 plus frames a second, you're really going to need to sacrifice some visual quality for it. But then there's the sound design, which I would describe as average. While the gun sounds do have some nice environmental echo effects, they don't really have all that much oomph to them, and pretty much all of them sound exactly the same. Or if there are differences in the sound effects, you barely notice them at best. I guess the idea there is that they're way more focused on stats than they are on actually making any of the guns feel or sound unique, but it is somewhat disappointing. The voice actors mostly do a pretty decent job, although several of the accents are very stereotypical, and they're very obviously trying to be stereotypical. It ends up coming across as pretty contrived and lazy when you start to think about it. I mean, one of the guys sounds like he's trying to do a bad Godfather impression, for example. You can't listen to that and not go, oh, come on, really? But all the main characters for the storyline are pretty decently voiced. They're not exactly the best out there, but they definitely don't do a bad job.
It's not the same. You have no idea how much I wanted to be in the field. I trained for a scenario like this my entire life, but it's worse than anything we could have imagined.
And you do also have Brandon Keener doing the voice of Isaac, which is the computer system that interacts with you while you're out in the field. And if you have absolutely no idea who I'm talking about, he played Garrus Vakarian in Mass Effect, and in fact it pretty much sounds like Garrus is leading you around with the Isaac system in this. So that's mildly amusing, but then there's the music, which is completely forgettable. It's some fairly light electronic music that is not really all that good at creating much of a mood, and it's all just extremely bland. There's not really a single track in here that sticks out, and you're just going to not notice it after a while. It got to the point where I would have my media player in the background just blaring music of whatever I felt like listening to, or I would have a podcast going in the background or something along those lines, where I didn't really need to watch it, but I could listen to it and get the full effect, really. Because after a while, the music in The Division is just boring and you end up not really giving a crap about it. So while the visual presentation is pretty impressive, the sound design is a bit more of a mixed bag. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you are a member of The Division. Basically a force of elite special agents that go in and start to restore order when order has effectively collapsed. They are supposed to work with emergency responders to bring order to chaos, and in the case of what happens in The Division, they're activated when something known as the dollar flu causes mass chaos in New York, and thus the entirety of Manhattan is put under quarantine. So you basically go in there to restore order and find out what happened to the previous agents that went before you and basically went silent afterwards. And to make a long story short, basically what ends up happening is the shit hits the fan, you get sent in, and in the process of getting sent in, the shit hits the fan even more. You end up having to establish a headquarters, go out and restore various aspects of the city back to functionality, as well as combat the various groups that are running the streets now. And along the way, you find out more about the virus and the people who made it and why they made it, and the reason why they made it is incredibly stupid. On top of this, you end up running into something called the Last Man Battalion, which is a PMC that are basically trying to bring fascist order to the city. Now, I am going to get into some mild spoilers here, but I will mention something about some more significant spoilers in a moment. The mild spoilers are that not only is the reason for the creation of the virus stupid, but the actual final boss fight of the game is incredibly lame. You basically go up against an attack helicopter like you did in Rainbow Six Vegas 2, and it's just a lame bullet sponge boss battle. And after that, the game just kinda ends. It gives you the reason for the creation of the virus, and then you get one final echo, which is these kind of cool visualizations of things that were going on in the past, accompanied with audio, and that explains a bit more of plot for what could be a sequel or some DLC or whatever, but within the context of the actual game, it basically just says, okay, we're done, go explore the Dark Zone now, bye. Which in turn makes you go, wait a minute, that's it? That was your big plot? Oh, come on. Now here's where I'm going to get into the major spoilers for what's going on with that, just so you understand how incredibly stupid and lame the ending is, because it's hard to really understand that without actually spoiling the plot for you. So if you don't want to hear the spoilers, just skip ahead to the time I'm showing on the video right now, because from here on out I'm going to say that you have had fair warning, and thus if the plot is spoiled for you and you're going to start bitching, well, you have no right to bitch at me. It's your own fault for not skipping ahead. Now then, with the spoiler warning out of the way, the reason that the virus was created was to control the human population. Yeah, he made the virus to be as ridiculously lethal as it is because he thinks there's too many people for Mother Earth to sustain. Yeah, when that plot reveal happens, you just sit there going, really? You're going there? Oh, come on. Similarly, when they introduce the members of the Division that went rogue to the plot, it just starts to basically shit the bed. Because this guy knows what he's talking about, clearly. He knows the real order of the world. It's not the order that you're trying to re-establish by being a fairly optimistic member of the Division. Oh, no, 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 no. According to him, the best order to things is exactly what is happening in the streets when you show up to actually start bringing order to the streets, which is people just murdering, pillaging, and looting as they see fit. He offers basically no explanation whatsoever for this other than, okay, the Division abandoned me, therefore survival of the fittest is the best thing ever. It is really difficult to take this guy seriously, because basically all you hear whenever he starts talking is the Linkin Park song Crawling, which you can look up at your own leisure because, quite frankly, I hate that song. But anyway, the point is that this guy sounds like he's supposed to be set up as some big badass who thinks he knows how the world works and thus he's going to try to reclaim it in his own image or whatever. But when you really get down to it, he's basically just a petulant, edgy brat going through a phase. And thus the setup for extra DLC or a sequel is pretty wimpy when you get down to it, especially when the guy literally just says, "Have you seen the Dark Zone? You should go there now." It's so painfully obvious that they didn't really have a way to segue into the Dark Zone itself as the endgame, and so they ultimately just decided to throw that in there as a passing mention to try to tie it into the plot, but you don't get any plot out of the Dark Zone. The Dark Zone is just a PvP area with a bunch of NPCs that you can murderize in it. There are no Dark Zone missions other than the Dark Zone supply drops, and really the only point to the Dark Zone is shoot stuff, get loot. And it's really nothing more than that. So let's go ahead and start actually delving into the gameplay mechanics and finding out exactly what makes it tick, because obviously the story isn't gonna do it. After you go through character creation, which allows you to select a male or female agent and customize their face and their hairstyle as well as makeup or piercings, and there's really not many options at all in there, so that point's kind of moot actually. You're dropped into the tutorial area, which is Brooklyn, and after you complete the tutorial area, you go into Manhattan proper and you start to actually do what you're supposed to be doing, which is complete missions first to get different wings of your headquarters opening up. You have a medical wing, a security wing, and a tech wing, and these can be upgraded over time with various supplies that you can get from completing encounters, which are these quick missions that you can complete that are basically just things like secure the supply drop, or assist the JTF field operation, or something along those lines. Or for larger amounts of the supplies, you can complete the various missions that are available to you. These are larger, more involved, and actually involve the plot of the game, so that's where you're going to be finding the majority of what I described previously, and you're also going to find that every single one of them has a boss fight, and on top of that, they give you a very large amount of the supplies once you've completed them for the first time. You can go back and redo these missions on higher difficulties if you wish, but at that point you're basically just getting experience points and loot. The missions themselves, as well as the encounters, are all very straightforward, very simple, and usually involve little more than going into an area, shooting a bunch of bad guys, and maybe flipping a switch or two. This also extends to the various side missions, which don't give you any of the supplies for the various wings, but they do give you things like blueprints or large amounts of credits or experience or things like that. So from the very earliest parts of the game all the way up through the very end of the game, you're basically doing the exact same handful of things over and over and over again. The problem with that is twofold. First off, that's extremely repetitive. It's only really saved by the fact that every single encounter lasts maybe 2 to 5 minutes at most, so you're not really dealing with things that take an absolutely massive amount of time. You can just jump in, play an encounter or two, and be done in the span of maybe 15-20 minutes, which is actually mostly how I was able to keep playing this thing for as long as I did. But when you get down to it, it really does fall to the moment-to-moment gameplay that you're going to be experiencing, because the base customization is non-existent. You basically just upgrade things in a straight pattern throughout the entirety of the game. You do get some leeway in what upgrades get done when, but other than that, it's very straightforward. There's really nothing to it other than, hey, you now have this bonus available to you, you have this ability available to you, that sort of thing. So what is the moment-to-moment gameplay in The Division like anyway? Well, basically, you just run around, you use a very simple cover-based mechanic to aim and shoot at stuff. You have 3 weapon slots, 2 of which are primary weapons like assault rifles, sniper rifles, and that sort of thing, and one of which is a handgun slot, where your handgun actually gets infinite ammunition. You do have to reload it, but you have an infinite pool of ammo to reload from, and the other 2 of which have actual finite ammo. You can blind fire or you can more accurately aim, but actually sticking yourself out to aim does of course make you vulnerable, and you can of course use grenades as well to either flush enemies out of cover or to do some damage or apply various effects, because they will apply different effects depending on what grenades they are. Or you can actually use one of your 2 slots for special abilities. These can be things like a launcher that shoots out healing projectiles that will allow you to heal people within a certain radius, or things like an automated sentry, or things like a ballistic shield. All these different abilities that basically have to be synchronized with other players, which is problematic because first off, you only get 2 ability slots, and you also have the issue of, well, there really aren't all that many people playing this thing, and those that are playing it are mostly people who've already completed the game and are level 229 in the Dark Zone. Good luck, you're gonna need it. Ultimately, I ended up doing the exact same thing that I did during the beta, which was go with the 2 healing abilities, one of which is called Pulse, which gives you a bunch of bonuses on every enemy that it scans, and also that healing ability that I previously mentioned. Well, I say healing abilities, but I meant medical wing abilities because they're both medical wing abilities, but whatever. Point is that you can use whatever abilities you want that are available to you in those 2 slots, and you can actually swap out those abilities as you see fit. So if you want to just stop using one particular ability, let's say I just wanted to stop using the pulse ability, I could instead switch it over to the turret ability or whatever other abilities I have unlocked. This basically means that there's no real such thing as speccing your character out. You can kind of spec them around the abilities, because some of the modifications that you can get for your gear will allow you to get different bonuses to certain abilities, but mostly it's just a matter of personal preference. What isn't so much a matter of personal preference is how you spec your gear out, which you ideally go for a specific build that I don't know and I don't really care to know. Because once you hit a certain point when you've actually gotten your level all the way up to 30 and you've gotten your Dark Zone level all the way up to, I believe, 60, you can't level up anymore. The way you level up past that is through the gear that you're wearing, which is kind of an idiotic way of doing a leveling system, but whatever. At any rate, the max level as of right now appears to be 229, and that's all through the ultra high level gear that you can get. Here's the really big problem with that logic, the idea that you would want to level up past level 60 in the Dark Zone and level 30 on your normal level in order to get to level 229. At that point, the only reason you would even bother leveling up anymore at all is because of the Dark Zone. Because at that point, you're out of story missions, you're out of encounters, the only thing you have left is the Dark Zone. And the only thing that the Dark Zone has to offer is higher level loot. So at that point, you're really just grinding for gear so you can grind for more gear. It's a pretty idiotic way of handling the endgame, and it means that there's basically no lasting appeal once you've completed all the missions and the encounters. Because at that point, the core gameplay has just worn on you throughout the entirety of the game. You're dealing with a cover-based shooting system that is pretty simplistic when you get down to it, but with a stats system that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. You have toughness, you have the firearms proficiency, and then you have electronics, which go up and down based on the gear you've gotten. Honestly, I have no idea how they actually factor into anything, because the game does an absolutely horrible job of explaining that to you, which in turn means that you basically have no idea how powerful you actually are. This means that you can have your character decked out in the highest level gear that you can find. You've got a really high armor rating. You've got some pretty high DPS going on. You've got all of your perks unlocked. You've got your talents, which are these slottable passive bonuses that you can get, all configured the way you like them. And then you actually go into a battle, whether it be against the AI or against an actual player, and suddenly you find you're really not as well built as you thought you were. I've actually run into numerous instances where I've gone up against other players in the Dark Zone and they pretty much one-shot me while I have emptied an entire magazine or more into them and it barely even scratched them. And I have no idea why, because they were the same level as me, at least from appearances, so I couldn't tell how they were spec'd out. I don't know exactly what they had in order to make them basically become a massive damage sponge. In fact, at one point when I was in the Dark Zone, pretty much everybody was going after this one guy who wasn't really very high level, but he was spec'd out in such a way that basically nobody could kill him. So he ended up going in basically the highest level of rogue and surviving because nobody could take him down. This brings up something that is particularly annoying about the Dark Zone. If you do enough damage to another player, you are marked as a rogue. This means that other players will get some slight bonuses for taking you down, and you'll get even harsher penalties for dying in the Dark Zone while you've got that rogue status. Yes, you heard that right, even harsher penalties, because whenever you die in the Dark Zone, not only do you lose experience, you also lose Dark Zone funds, which are the currency that you can only use on Dark Zone gear. It is entirely possible to die in the Dark Zone and go down a level or more because the penalties are just that high. They did tweak it to some degree over the course of the months after its release, but it's still a very annoying problem. Similarly annoying are the constantly respawning enemies. You'll find that the enemy NPCs in the Dark Zone will just constantly be respawning, and usually right behind you, so your cover means basically nothing. And thus, if you're going alone in the Dark Zone, which is what I ended up having to do almost the entirety of the time, you get mowed down pretty quick. And this is really all for loot that's not much better, if at all, from the stuff you're finding in the single player or co-op parts of the game. In fact, most of the time when I would find loot in the Dark Zone, I would just end up selling it later on for credits so I could buy stuff from the advanced weapons vendor in the actual headquarters, which then would give me way better stuff than I actually had. And it was not remotely uncommon for me to find gear that was a good 5 or 6 levels higher than the gear I had, but it was still inferior to it. The stat system in The Division just doesn't make any sense. It goes all over the place, and it's really hard to figure out how powerful you are in comparison to everyone else, or even the NPCs. And the fact that it is all stat-based means that all of the enemies are absolute bullet sponges. It's not quite as bad in the early parts of the game, but the further in you get, the more spongy the enemies get, and it gets incredibly unsatisfying to fight them. Moreover, it's extremely hard to suspend your disbelief with those bullet sponges because they're just dudes running around in hoodies for the most part. When you get to the later parts of the game and you're running into the PMC and the Rikers and such, then you find that you're running into guys who are more heavily armored, but even then, it still doesn't make much sense for them to be as bullet spongy as they are. Something like that can fly when you're running around with nebulous space weaponry or weird fantasy gear, but in the case of a modern day game where you're using guns that are easily identifiable and which we know exactly what kind of damage they're capable of, it's really difficult to suspend disbelief. I can totally get some alien taking a massive laser blast to the face and still being okay because his shielding held up, but I can't take some random dude in a hoodie taking about 27.62 rounds to the face and just being perfectly fine. It just ends up looking completely absurd. And when you combine that with how nonsensical the stat system is, how unsatisfying the gunplay is in general, where it's just basic cover-based third-person shooting at its most mediocre, with a story that's pretty much just haphazardly slapped together in order to have a co-op game built around it, with the co-op itself not really being feasible anymore due to the general lack of players, and on top of that, just the gameplay not really facilitating co-op very well. And then just throw in the Dark Zone to put a monkey wrench into the whole thing and have an entire area where the entire purpose of it is just to get more loot so you can get more loot. And in so doing, simultaneously encourage and discourage going rogue and going into the PvP stuff, because the loot that you actually get in the Dark Zone pretty much just sucks, and thus isn't worth the effort of going rogue to get it. It's basically like Ubisoft Massive was told by corporate to make a looter shooter because Borderlands is popular and use the Tom Clancy license to do it, but they had no idea how to do it, and the end result is a complete disaster. I mean, hell, you can get underleveled incredibly quickly in the Dark Zone and just have to sit there and grind for hours on end in order to get up to the level you need to be for a reasonable degree of better loot. And the only way to get Dark Zone experience is by just farming enemies in the Dark Zone, which in itself is basically an exercise in futility. There effectively is no endgame here. It's just, okay, get more loot. There's no story missions or anything like that in the Dark Zone. You just go in there, you shoot a bunch of generic NPCs, some of which have names and continually respawn, others of which just are generic ones that constantly respawn. And occasionally you'll run into a player who's an asshole and decides they want to go rogue just because they're bored and just starts mowing down everybody in their path and you can't do a thing about it. Or you might get unbelievably lucky and run into other players and form up a group and just go farm enemies and get some pretty crappy loot that you'll just end up selling anyway. So ultimately, there's only two real saving graces here. One, you can play this, generally speaking, in very short play sessions. If you just have maybe 10-15 minutes to kill, then you basically can just hop into this thing and screw around with it for that long, and in that regard, it's not the worst game I've ever seen, but that's the only real substantive one, because the only other saving grace is the visuals are impressive. And that's not anywhere near enough to save this thing. The more you play The Division, the more you realize that it's basically trying to go for the addiction-style gameplay, but failing miserably at it. And that ultimately means it doesn't actually have any real longevity. There's no real substance here. It's just a very weak cover-based looter shooter that doesn't really have any good loot and is just incredibly boring to boot. Which is a real shame, because they could have used this as a great opportunity to start questioning the whole judge, jury, and executioner idea that this thing has. Because when you go into this environment, you're basically just sitting there like Judge Dredd. You are judge, jury, and executioner, and you do it all in one fell swoop. There is no due process here. There's just dudes in the street with AKs, and you just mow them down like nothing. Missed a great opportunity for ethical dilemmas there. They missed great opportunities for actual role-playing elements, for character customization. Ultimately, what you got is just a bunch of really weak clothing options that you have to find throughout the game. And hell, even the clothing that you're wearing when you start out is randomized, so it's not like you have tons of customization options to begin with. Really, that's the way I can best sum this thing up. It had potential, and there were tons of things they could have done with it that could have been way more interesting than what we got. And ultimately, what we got was just a really, really wimpy looter shooter that doesn't deserve your time or your money. I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.